This is Unit 7, Video 8. In this video, we will devote some time to looking at and talking about solids. Now, we're not going to talk too much about solids. In fact, we've been talking about liquids the whole time, and we're studying solids just for a small portion of time. And there's really two major ideas with solids. Solids fall into two groups. Something called a crystalline solid, in which you have a crystal, which refers to the fact that the particles are ordered, very highly ordered. This happens in ice, salt, and diamonds. And then you have what's called an amorphous solid. Amorphous is a Greek term meaning no shape, and in which particles are randomly arranged. And you can see this in glass, you can also see this in plastics. So these are the two categories of solids. Now these two categories of solids have actually different properties. As you'll see, they interact with light differently, and they actually have different heats of fusion. And it's possible for the same substance to be both crystalline and amorphous. A famous example of this is glass. Glass can be crystalline or it can be amorphous. So if you have the crystalline version of glass, it'll have one set of properties. If you have the amorphous version of glass, it has another set of properties. So we have diagram pictures of this. So crystalline glass, called silicon dioxide, or think of sand, you may know that glass comes from sand, has an ordered arrangement of silicon and oxygen. And essentially it's silicon dioxide, so this would be the silicon atom, this would be two oxygen atoms, and this unit right here kind of looks like an H2O molecule, is then combined with other molecules, with this molecule, and with this molecule. Now what's interesting is that all of these are covalent bonds. They actually create this huge network, a crystalline network. And what you see is you see big crystals on our level that are reflecting the structure, the ordered structure at the molecular level, and this is usually called quartz. There are many different versions of quartz. There's pink quartz, yellow quartz, white quartz, there's black quartz, and all those are due to impurities in the crystalline structure. And quartz is the version of glass that is crystalline in nature. And this is a three-dimensional, even though this shows a 2D representation, you can extrapolate this into 3 dimensions, and you can build a 3-dimensional network of these. Now, the version that's amorphous looks like glass. So here is the version of silicon dioxide. Silicon dioxide glass is used in glassware, in laboratory glassware, so we use this all over the place. And you'll notice that there's really not much order between these. Here are individual SiO2 molecules again, but they're not in an ordered arrangement. You have a bigger opening here, you have a smaller opening here, less molecules, more molecules. And this essentially doesn't look very crystalline, and it interacts with light differently. It has a different, like I said, heat of fusion. It actually has a different melting point, or it has, usually amorphous solids have a range of melting points. They don't have a distinct, crisp, clear melting point. They have a range of melting points. So it begins melting, at like 1,200 Celsius, and slowly, eventually melts at 1,300 Celsius. That range is seen in amorphous solids, where crystalline solids have a distinct temperature melting point. So this ordered arrangement is seen in many substances. A very famous substance, water. You can see this ordered arrangement in snowflakes. And it's interesting that snowflakes always have a hexagonal pattern. They have a 6-sided arrangement. And this is due to the fact that on the molecular scale, these form in a hexagonal pattern. So one of the most famous versions of ice is actually hexagonal ice. Turns out there are a few different types of ice. You can actually bring ice together in different ways. Hexagonal is one of the most common. Another one is called cubic, where it's more of a cube than a hexagon. But a hexagonal version of water appears in ice or snowflakes. And every snowflake looks different. You can become a snowflake artist and photograph snowflakes and post them online, and so for others to enjoy. So now this happens due to hydrogen bonding. It's really interesting that hydrogen bonding has this effect. Remember, water as a liquid is more dense, and as a solid is less dense. So what happens is, as the particles slow down, as you reduce the temperature, the hydrogen bonding, strong hydrogen bonding between a hydrogen here and an oxygen here locks these guys to where they line up to each other. And this structure, this lattice, actually allows them to expand, essentially. And as they expand, there's empty spaces that form between molecules, allowing it to expand. And these hydrogen bonds actually make water do this, creating a very, very important property of water, and that is water is able to erode away big, big rocks. So you can have a huge, humongous rock that can be crushed over time by water into tiny little pebbles, and that's what sand is. So sand, little tiny particles of silicon dioxide, has been demolished, has been completely destroyed by none other than H2O. As it freezes, it expands, so if it percolates through a big rock, upon expanding, it actually breaks the rock into little pieces. So water has this powerful ability to break solids into little tiny sand pieces. So I highly respect water for this property. So let's talk a little bit about crystalline solids. Now, a crystalline solid has what's called a unit cell. And the unit cell is essentially a repeating pattern or a repeating unit of a huge crystal. So because crystals are ordered, you can actually find a unit, a portion of it, that essentially just repeats. And you can just multiply it over and under, and the same thing just gets copied over and over and over and over. And we can actually find a unit cell for every solid, a crystalline solid. And the unit cell can actually be of three types. Something called a primitive cubic, where you essentially have, think of a cube, you have an atom on every corner of the cube. You can have a body-centered cubic, you have an atom in every corner of the cube, and then you have an atom smack in the middle of the cube. You have what's called a face-centered cubic, where you have on every face of the cube, there are 6 faces to a cube, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then one in front, one in back, and you have essentially an atom stuck. So half of it is below, half of it's above, and that's kind of the idea. So depending on the structure, you'll have different arrangements, depending if it's ice or if it's salt, and so forth. And these spheres can either be atoms, they can be ions in terms of salt, or they can be molecules in terms of water. So these are just particles that are represented. Now, there are 7 different crystal systems, what are called crystal systems. So these cubes, this unit cell, if it's a perfect unit cell, then it looks like this. In fact, if all the sides are equal length and all the angles are 90 degrees, all these are 90 degrees, then you have one arrangement. Here's the hexagonal, the version that water makes. So here the angles are different, and the measurements of the sides are different. You can have something called tetragonal, trigonal, orthorhombic, monoclinic, and triclinic. You don't have to worry about memorizing these or even understanding them, but what you realize is there is 2 things that work here. It's the length of your cube, or the length of the sides of your cube, and then the angle of it. It could be 90 degrees, it could be less than 90 degrees. So you'll notice that some of these are kind of slanted. That's because they have less than 90 or more than 90 degree angles. So these parameters can actually be measured, and scientists have measured them, and you can come up with and put them in one of these 7 categories. It's interesting that the number 7 shows up. There are 7 different types of crystal systems, and here is an example of a real crystal that applies to all these. That's the idea. Now, where this is important is we are able to look into a crystal and see what it's arranged, like using X-ray techniques, something called X-ray diffraction. And the technique itself is called X-ray crystallography. So it's called X-ray crystallography because you look at crystals. What you have to do is you have to get a solid into its crystal form. You have to actually slowly cool the substance to make sure it's nice and crystalline. And once you got your crystal, you can actually go ahead and take that crystal and shine some X-rays at it. And what happens is, because of something called diffraction just means the crystal takes and scatters the light ray. So say this is a light ray, it scatters the light ray in a predictable manner. And these particles being arranged perfectly allow the light to be scattered, and then you can actually detect that. You can measure what the light looks like coming out, and then analyzing it. And this is pretty complex. We're not going to go into it here, obviously, but you can actually determine the crystalline structure. You can determine if it's monoclinic, if it's one of those 7 structures that we've looked at. You can actually, from it, you can determine the length of the unit cell. You can also determine the angle of the unit cell from doing this technique. A very important technique. In fact, you have crystallographers that are specialized in just this part of chemistry and figuring out what a structure looks like in its solid state. So here is a little diagram or a little picture of what happens. You have some X-rays here, and the X-ray tube producing X-rays, and usually you pass it through a little opening so that way you can focus the X-rays. You have your crystalline substance here. It's nice and ordered, and that crystalline substance then diffracts the X-rays. Then you get what's called a pattern on a plate, photographic plate. And this pattern can be analyzed, and from this pattern you can find out eventually what the crystal looks like. Again, some pretty complex techniques are involved in doing this, but scientists have done this, actually starting in the early 1900s, been doing this. So what you get is, here are some examples of some photographic plates. You have what's called a diffraction pattern, and this diffraction pattern is different for every different substance. So notice, it looks different. Every chemical compound will have a slightly different diffraction pattern, and you can measure, the distance between here and so forth, and you can actually find out what the angles and what the lengths are. So very important. In fact, there is a famous example of this, and famously, the DNA was determined to be a double helix using this technique. So these guys here, Watson and Crick, which you may have heard of from biology, actually had a knowledge of how X-ray diffraction works, and they could interpret the results, and they were the first to essentially figure out the DNA is a double helix, or they were the first to propose. Among the first to propose, there is another character that is not in the books officially, Rosalind Franklin. You may have heard of her, but this double helix was resolved using this technique. So really important technique. And here's an actual picture of the photographic plate coming out. You can actually see, it's interesting that you can see the double helix structure, sort of, this X, where it intertwines. So very famous technique used. Here is a machine, a modern machine that's used to do the same thing, called an X-ray diffractometer. So what happens is it's able to focus high energy beams, and then there's a way to put a sample on here. And actually, I'm going to show you in the next picture one of a scientist that is actually right in front of one of these, working with one of these, an X-ray diffractometer. And you may recognize the scientist from previous engagements. Let's see, what do we have here? We have the young Z. What he's holding here is actually a little device on the tip of which is a crystal. So when I did my research for my master's thesis, I actually had to produce crystal. So it took a little bit of time to make sure the crystal is nice and ordered. I did it through evaporation. And then we stuck it into a diffractometer, and that diffractometer then, this crystal is actually placed on here, nice and steady. In the background, what we have is we have a bunch of liquid nitrogen. It's a little hard to see, but this is liquid nitrogen. And the liquid nitrogen keeps the crystal cold and frozen, not allowing it to melt, to make sure it's in a solid state. And then through here, we pump some X-rays. Partly why you need liquid nitrogen is because the X-rays will provide a lot of energy to the crystal, and it can melt the crystal, disrupt the crystal structure, so you have to have it very, very cool. And notice we have insulated tubing and so forth as it goes into it. And then this is all connected nowadays to a computer, and the data is collected, and then the computer allows you to determine the structure of your crystal. So I did this with Professor Craig Wheeler. So this is Dr. Wheeler at Eastern Illinois University, EIU in Southern Illinois. Here I am with the master himself. Here's the apprentice, working with the master. He is a crystallographer at EIU, and a lot of people from all over the United States actually send him samples, and his task is to open up the sample and determine its structure and send them back the data for a nominal fee of a few $1,000s. He'll do this for you. So if you want your structure to be resolved, just look him up, contact him, and he'll do the work for you. Now, he was fond of saying he had this to hang up in his lab, in his crystallography lab, And this compares a regular chemist, a run-of-the-mill, regular true chemist, to a crystallographer, of which he was. And it said this: the difference between a chemist and a crystallographer can be compared to two people who try to ascertain what furniture is present in a dark room. And this is kind of like a chemist trying to work with a beaker of chemicals, trying to find out what's in there, how it's arranged, and structure, and so forth. One probes around in the dark, breaking the china, while the other one stays by the door and switches on the light. And so we have a high respect for crystallographers out there. Not many of them out there, but they can look into a chemical structure, a chemical to see the structure, which is pretty impressive. All right, so this wraps up video 8 of Unit 7.